Hello and welcome to this Intelligence Squared debate with me, Philippa Thomas. And actually, I'm going to start by asking you something. I want to get an idea from you, the audience, about where you stand on our hot topic today. So we're going to ask you to submit a pre-vote to vote yes or no now on whether you think, on balance, the United States is a force for good in the world. So we're asking you to vote. We'll let you know the results of this pre-vote before we get into the meat of our back and forth between our two speakers. If you're unsure, of course you might be, vote undecided. And we will announce the results of your pre-vote after we've heard our opening statements. So that's a way in which we want you to get involved right at the start. We are, of course, also going to be asking you to submit your questions to really engage in this question. People feel very strongly about it one way or another, and what you hear in the next few minutes, who knows, it may change your mind. So here's the theme that we're looking at today here on Intelligence Squared. Many in the world do see the United States as a force for good. It applies pressure on authoritarian regimes like Iran to abide by human rights. It supports nations in great need, Ukraine, for example, defending its sovereignty against the imperial aggression from next door. But others argue, well, look at the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and other parts of the world, which show that American exceptionalism and the country's proud assumption that it can act as the world's policeman wreak irrevocable havoc on the wider world. And the world is paying a price for that assumption. So, is American foreign policy a force for good, or is it damaging the world? What do you think about its impact? In a moment, our two speakers will make their opening statements to try to persuade you. Then I'll take your questions and encourage some debate between the speakers. We'll end our debate this hour with two short closing statements, and then I'm going to invite you all to make another vote, which I will announce before 2 p.m. Eastern or 6 GMT. So, pretty much time for me to stop talking. I'm going to introduce our speakers one by one so you can hear their opening statements. And our first speaker is Shadi Hamid, who I'm sure you probably know, author, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, contributor for The Atlantic. His books include Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, and his new book is The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. Shadi also co-hosts the podcast Wisdom of Crowds, which examines why bad people believe what they believe. And Shadi, we're giving you about 5 minutes to talk about whether we should see America as a force for good in the world. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Philippa. Thanks for having me. Okay, let's get right to it. So I was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened. And I think for my generation, our formative experience was one in which American power was used for destructive ends. And two endless wars, for starters. That's the most obvious example. So all of this meant that I viewed America's role in a primarily negative light because it was negative. And in the Middle East, despite all the grandiose rhetoric about democracy, the US did continue supporting some of the world's most repressive regimes. And I think for those on the left, this was nothing new. It was kind of self-evident. I was more of a leftist in college, and I spent my years reading Noam Chomsky and other leftist critics of U.S. foreign policy. And let's be honest, they weren't entirely wrong. America may have been a force for good in some places at some times, but at other times and in other regions, it had been anything but. So I'm not arguing that America is a force for good in some kind of absolute sense. There are no absolutes in politics. My argument is that America is a force for good relative to all the other possibilities before us. And this is the only rubric that matters because we live in the real world, and this real world has a number of challengers and competitors. If the US falls, it will be a country like China that fills the vacuum. That's what's at stake. So without America as a hegemonic force, China will further expand its economic and military influence, and this time there will be no one to counter it. So it's auspicious timing that we're having this debate today because I think 2022 was the year that skeptics of American power got a taste of what a post American world might actually look like. We have China's aggression towards Taiwan, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think these things help put matters in perspective. So, one question I would pose is, in light of what we've seen, can anyone really argue still that the US is a uniquely malevolent force in global politics? I would suggest that the answer to that is no. Let me take the argument one step further. Not only is the US preferable to the available alternatives, but also the United States is better. And we are better because we are a democracy for all of our flaws. And, as I argue in my book, which is called The Problem of Democracy, and I think there is also a solution. Well, the divide between democracy and autocracy is fundamental. It's key to this conversation. It cuts to the core of what it means to be a human being. Dictatorships, they elevate the nation and the leader as ultimate ends. Individuals have no inherent worth beyond their service to the state. And we're seeing that in Russia today, for example, with hundreds of thousands of Russian men leaving for precisely this reason. Authoritarianism corrupts society and it twists the soul. And it makes humans other than what God intended them to be. Now, that might all sound a bit grandiose, but I want to just translate that into practicalities as I begin to wrap up here. The fact that one country was democratic and claimed that it was better because it was democratic provided a very real demonstration effect. The more the US eclipsed the Soviet Union, the more pro democracy forces were strengthened. And if you don't believe me, consider the counterfactual. Imagine if the Soviet Union had somehow beaten the US during the Cold War. Well, the third wave of democratization in the 1990s probably would have never happened. And also, just more broadly, the fact that America was a superpower and is a superpower has been central to the expansion of democracy across the globe. We can look at the numbers. By the end of World War II, only around 8% of countries were democratic. As of 2020, according to the VDEM index, the figure had increased to over 50%. That's a massive increase. The interesting thing, though, is most of this remarkable growth took place during and after the decline of the Soviet Union. In other words, it was only when American power was unrivaled that democracy truly took hold. What about hypocrisy? And this is where I'll close up. One of the most consistent charges against the US is that it says one thing but does another. It's true. I agree with that. But even here, hypocrisy is better than the alternative. The French author Rochefoucauld once said that hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. And I think he was onto something. After all, it's difficult to betray one's ideals if one doesn't have any to begin with. And so for the United States, the charge of hypocrisy is effective because it speaks to something true. Yes, we are hypocritical. On the other hand, consider China or Russia. No one accuses China of hypocrisy because it backs friendly dictators. That would make little sense. No one expects China to promote democracy abroad. No one expects China to be better. So there isn't a gap. And so, in this sense, trying to be better, at least having the possibility of being better, that leads to hypocrisy, but that is one of the costs of trying to be moral. Or to put it differently, insofar as hypocrisy points to an aspiration that isn't met, at least the aspiration remains. And for me, this is better than the alternative. Thank you.
Shadi Hamid, thank you, arguing that on balance, the US is a force for good in the world. Now, remember, we're going to ask for your questions. We can also encourage you to join the debate on Twitter, where the hashtag is IQ2. But Listen first to our next speaker. Samuel Moyn is going to also have an introductory statement. Samuel is Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University, and his areas of interest in legal scholarship include international law, human rights, the law of war, and Sam's most recent book is Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. So, for the next 5 minutes, Sam, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Now, there are worse alternatives to American hegemony and power. There's no doubt about that. But there are also better alternatives, better imaginable alternatives, and alternatives it's our obligation to envision and bring about. Because the harsh truth is this, that in its unipolar moment after 1989, America squandered an enormous chance to advance universal values. Now, of course, Shadi is right that there has been a wave of democratization under America's watch. Eventually, it actually started in the 1970s, uh, and it's been in retreat lately. But I don't think America gets credit for that democratization, certainly not in every case. After all, it was mainly the fact that the Soviet Union disappeared that led a lot of countries to uh, choose liberal democracy and often demand it on their own terms. What America did, if we're talking about its foreign policy, was not helpful, and in two big ways. First, its militarism. During the Cold War, the United States intervened in a lot of places and set humanity back. Actually, its military interventionism increased after 1989. It wasn't just the two disastrous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was the war on terror more broadly and a global security net that was technologized through drones and surveillance, and remains, I think, sadly, our principal legacy in military terms. And I think we shouldn't restrict our attention when we think about our militarism to just direct interventions, because the United States also supervises the global arms trade. Most wars are fought with American weapons. And of course, it also fights proxy wars. But I would look beyond the military history of the period since 1989, in which America has done so much harm to so many people, to its broader foreign policy, which was really not about spreading democracy. It was really about spreading what we call neoliberalism. Like its great predecessor, the United Kingdom, in the 19th century, the United States stood most of all not for free self government, but for freedom of transaction. And this had massive, and I think we can now see terrible effects on the fate of democracy worldwide. If we begin to ask why so many people are tempted in our day to throw democracy overboard, it's because of the consequences of the fact that America chose its unipolar moment as one when it would be a neoliberal power, uh, advancing the interests not of all, but of the rich on the world stage. There's one last reason I think we should conclude that America squandered its moment in the sun after the Cold War, its moment of unipolarity. And that's that it failed even in the most basic task for any state that wants to present itself as universal, and that's to be an exemplar or a model society. We now can see very clearly that America did not make itself globally appealing enough, in part because of the terrible legacies of hierarchy that it's failed really to overcome, as current history demonstrates. It's very hard to think that America can be a credible standard bearer for liberalism or democracy when its people are driven to elect Donald Trump. Now, I'll close with a couple of remarks about Russia and China, because of course it would be worse if they filled a vacuum. But that's not going to happen. We know that in some sense we have a shifting uh, a scene in which there's not going to be unipolarity anymore, but multipolarity. Russia is not a major challenger to the world order the United States has been, although it's engaged in noxious behavior recently in its own neighborhood. We don't know what China wants to do and will do as it ascends to rival the United States, as it has been doing. What we can say is that the American choice to have the first Cold War was an outrage for humanity. It wasn't about supporting democracy, except in some places and in the narrowest sense, and it incurred carnage on a world scale. Why we would think that the idea of democracy demands a confrontational view of our future relationship with Chinese power is beyond me. And it just seems to me that it would involve repeating the errors that America has been making, not just during the Cold War, but since. Our hope, I think, lies in the creation of a better alternative, of which America has to be a part. But we can't rest content with American power as it has functioned in the last decades.
Samuel, thank you. I'm feeling confident that we're going to get questions and comments on this. And part of the reason is that you both have a job to do in convincing a large segment of the audience. Before we unpack a little bit of what you've said, I want to reveal the results of our first vote, which showed that when we're looking at the question, is the US on balance a force for good in the world? 35% of you out there say yes. 38% say no. 27% are undecided. I think that's pretty high. And so it shows that there's a challenge, but there's also an opportunity for both our speakers right now. I want to give you a chance to pick up on what each other has said, but I want to lob something in there first because it strikes me that the terms in which we are speaking are those of great power politics and who is the force for good in the world. But the matter of climate change and existential challenge and the role that the US is playing or not doesn't seem to be part of this canvas. And that might be the way that we have framed the question, but I'm interested that it doesn't seem to be part of the issue. Sam, I'm going to ask you to speak to that first, just
Well,
because.
I think that's a really important element to add to the debate, and I would argue it's part of my story of the misplaced priorities of the United States, along with its Western allies in the recent period. Because obviously, these states that have mainly been exporting, if not war, then a certain version of markets, have been the greatest polluters. They don't just remain so, but they have been in history, and they account for the climate change that we're experiencing now. And so part of the debate about what an appealing and sustainable economic model that we would want to connect with uh, the universal values I think Shadi and I both believe in would have to connect to an environmentally sustainable outcome. So just mindless pro-growth policies, which America has stood behind in recent decades, are absolutely part of this conversation, because we need to figure out how to have growth fairly distributed, since China wants its turn to enjoy it, while allowing the planet to survive growth in the long term.
Shadi, you've said America a force for good in the world relative to the other options we have, even with my bigger picture. Does that still hold?
Yeah. So I think this gets at a pretty fundamental point. America is a force for good because we're capable of changing and learning and self-correcting because we are a democracy. I don't believe China can be or become better because of the nature of its regime. And we're already seeing signs of this, where as time passes, China becomes more and more a one-man personalistic regime. and one that also, we should mention, commits genocide against its Muslim minority. And I don't think anyone would pretend that the U.S. is quite at that level of badness. So, in that sense, America always holds within it the possibility of other possibilities. So, on climate change, if we feel that we're not doing enough, that's probably true. But it's up to voters, it's up to people going to the ballot box to ask their representatives to prioritize that. And this gets, I think, to part of what Sam mentioned, the rise of Donald Trump. Does that make American democracy less appealing? Perhaps that's one way of looking at it. But for me, the election of Donald Trump and the fact that he was voted out of office shows that American democracy is resilient. We had a major test to our democracy and we survived, and not just survived. I think that in some ways we may even become stronger. We'll have to wait and see, and I can't guarantee that. But the fact that there are flaws, the fact that we don't always do good, I don't think is an argument against the democratic model. Because what is democracy after all? Democracy is the right to make the wrong choice. So if we vote for Donald Trump, then in some ways that should be instructive to other countries that they can vote for bad people too, but that doesn't negate the democratic idea. And I think on the most broad level, in terms of great power competition, I do think, contrary to what Sam suggested, that democracies and autocracies are mutually irreconcilable. And this, I think, is an important thing to add because um, I don't. So if we don't believe that China can be better because of its regime type, then we can't be optimistic about a better kind of multipolar world where the US and China share power. I think also, if we look at the bipolar world we had during the Cold War, when in some ways the US and the Soviet Union had spheres of influence, that led the US to support right wing anti communist governments in Latin America. Why? Because we were so obsessed with pushing back the Soviet Union. So that's why we don't want to go to a bipolar world where everything is about a direct confrontation with China. So before China rises to us to be on a closer level with the US, now is the time to make sure that China doesn't actually fill the vacuum, that China doesn't become equivalent to the Soviet Union and how it was during the Cold War. And now is the time to act.
Now is the time, of course, when Americans are voting again. The midterm season is upon us. And Sam, I'd like you to address that thought about the bounce back ability of thriving American democracy, or where we happen to be, and how much the States is a role model for the world.
Well, I actually agree with Shadi up to a point that the Donald Trump years were not a referendum on American
You're
democracy.
both speaking about them in the past tense.
That's right. We haven't gotten to 2024. We're only in 2022. Shadi is right that America did not come to the brink in the years of 2016 to 2022. But that doesn't mean that we should accept the low bar of survival as our aspirations for what America should stand for, and especially for what it should export. I actually would give Trump some credit while in office for trying to at least withdraw American troops from certain endless wars, even as he perpetuated others. But as with his, broader, um, you know, uh, thinking, I think Shadi is setting a really low bar for the America or the West, as long as it's doing something that's preferable to an autocracy or totalitarian state, then it gets a pass. Well, that's not how politics works. There's a range of options. In 2022, to come to your question, there's a referendum on the Democrats in power for 2 years, and it does look like it's not going to go well for the Democrats, which doesn't mean that 2022 is going to be a prelude to Trump's return, although that could happen. If the 2022 elections go as we expect, I think we have to conclude that the Democrats squandered their chance in power to present an appealing model of democracy to their own people who are going to vote, it seems, for a lot of misrepresentations. And that is very scary. And it doesn't mean that something terrible couldn't happen, although Shadi's right. And I've also argued that we shouldn't overstate America's own democratic backsliding. But it's
Shadi,
much more important to think about what we should stand for and what the Democrats, if we want them to win, should achieve to their time in power, and what America should achieve as its unipolar moment wanes. And I think we're far further into that process than Shadi is willing to admit.
Shadi, are you guilty of setting a really low bar?
Well, I suppose it's all relative, but let me try to higher the bar a little bit. So it's funny that when I talk to my white American friends and I say something like "I love America," increasingly they look at me as if I'm crazy. Like, how could you possibly be saying that at the current moment? And I think that one reason I'm optimistic about America and its role in the world is because of the children of immigrants, because of basically people of color, brown people, brownish people like me, because we still have a faith in the American idea. When I look at my white liberal elite friends, they're always perpetually in this mode of self doubt. And, that's their prerogative. But because I saw what America offered to my parents, to my family, that gives me a little bit of a different perspective. So the self-loathing, I think, is, and not to say that Sam is not doing this, but I do think that there is a lot of this discourse that I think doesn't give America a fair shake. And even if I compare America today in 2022 compared to after 9/11, I know which period I would choose, the latter. People can easily forget. After 9/11, there was very little room for dissent. Everyone was on a war footing, both Democrats and Republicans. To be part of the anti war movement, which I was when I was at Georgetown as an undergrad, was to be in a lonely place. And now we have a very vigorous debate. We have voices like Sam that are eloquently making the case that America isn't a force for good, and he's getting and that has mainstream appeal in a way that it didn't post 9/11. Muslims have become more normalized in American politics. I'm an American Muslim. So to see how we were treated, how we were looked at post 9/11 compared to the normalization that I'm very happy to be seeing. For example, the highest ranking Muslim elected Muslim official in American history could be a Trump endorsed candidate, Mahmoud Oz in Pennsylvania. I don't like Mahmoud Oz, but it's interesting to me that someone like him could be endorsed by Donald Trump, so on and so forth. So, it depends how we look at some of these issues, glass half full, half empty. I think there's a lot more of it that's full than we let on.
I think there are questions that come directly to this, questions coming in from the audience pretty quickly now. And I'm just going to remind you all out there that you can take part in our debate. On Twitter, the hashtag is IQ2. But here, you can also, it's probably pretty obvious, but you can see underneath your video screen, there's a tab that says Ask a Question. You click on it, the text box drops down, and you put your question into the box. If you want us to mention your name, type that in too. That means your name will be read out, and also it'll be part of the podcast. And you press send to submit the question. That's pretty obvious. There are quite a few questions already coming in, but do send in your questions. Do tweet about what you're hearing, whether your mind is changing, and we will be having a vote as well at the end. Shadi, I'm going to pick up on where you are, because you are contrasting that time when you were an undergrad and in Georgetown. And I remember at that time reporting from Ground Zero and Washington, going to flag factories, a flag on every lawn, the Patriot Act, the terror and the clampdown are very vivid still. Sarah asks, do you think, Shadi Hamid, if Trump was re-elected, you would change your mind on this?
Well, no, because I didn't change my mind the first time Trump was elected. In fact, I have to say that I was somewhat relieved over the 4 years of Trump's tenure. And I know that might sound weird, but considering what Trump had said in the lead up to him becoming president was even crazier than what he actually did. He talked about putting Muslims in a registry. He defended the internment of Japanese Americans. And yes, the 4 years of Trump in power were bad, but we never got to the level of catastrophe. Why? Because we had a vigorous media that was challenging Trump every step of the way. We had a Democratic Party that was defending Muslims during the time of the Muslim ban. And some of you might remember, but one of the ways that you could signal your anti-Trump credentials was to be ostentatiously pro-Muslim. You would go overboard with liking Muslims and all that. And that tells us something about our two party system. For all of its faults, if Republicans for a certain period are anti Muslim or anti immigrant, Democrats were able to step in and offer a different narrative. And I have no reason to doubt that if God forbid Trump wins again in 2024, that he will be facing many of those same challenges, and some of them might be even more vigorous. But again, what is democracy about? Democracy is seeing outcomes that you really don't like and coming to terms with that reality and then fighting for another day through the ballot box. That is
We're back.
always what we have at our disposal.
And we're back to the relative again, aren't we? And Samuel Moyn, I want to put a question to you that's just come in from our audience. Joe Biden said he would rebuild US alliances, but he hasn't. Aren't both parties becoming more America first? I detect perhaps in that question a note of disapproval.
Well, Joe Biden's record is mixed, and it's true that especially with regard to China and our trade policy, Biden has done things that are more continuous with Trump than not. But Vladimir Putin gave certain American hawks a gift by declaring an immoral, unnecessary war on Ukraine, which led to a rekindling of the Western alliance and an embrace uh, of NATO and its enduring importance that Donald Trump can never undo even if he's elected. So in that regard, Biden has done a lot to rebuild the status quo anti-Trump and the alliance structure. Where I think he's failed is, as Shadi says, registering adequately the protest vote that millions of Americans made in favor of Trump twice, more the second time than the first, and figuring out how to make American democracy appealing to its own citizens. And that's the question that I think has to be faced before we can even get to what it would mean for America to play a beneficent role in the world, which sadly I think it's just falling short.
And this, I think, brings us back round to Shadi's opening point that if you look at the other alternatives, let's think relatively, the US is a force for good in the world. Ahmed asks, Professor Moyn, do you think the UN is the institution which could bring about a better alternative to US hegemony?
Well, the truth is that the United Nations emerged originally as an emanation of US hegemony, and it survived because the Soviets were willing to go along in 1945. But as a great power arrangement, which is so vivid in the Security Council and who gets permanent membership and vetoes, it's also hobbled because the United Nations, as built, can't constrain great powers. It can't stop America when which has fought many more wars of choice than the Soviet Union or Russia ever did, and it can't constrain Russia. And I don't think anyone knows how to get beyond that limitation in the United Nations. That's why I think it will be much more plausible as the multipolar world that's already existing continues to look to Europeans, to look to other regional blocs to provide more justice and peace than Americans have sadly been able to provide in their unipolar moment.
Actually, that's the first mention of the Europeans, which maybe reflects relative weight in terms of global influence. But I did note that when Elon Musk said, Twitter, I'm back, this bird is flying, it was an EU commissioner who, tweeted him and said, well, where we are, there's going to be regulation, prepared to stand up to power. And Shadi, your thoughts on whether Europe is one of those powers that's perhaps been underestimated or not?
So at the end of the day, European power depends on American power. That without the U.S. security umbrella, countries like Germany and Sweden and Denmark wouldn't be able to strengthen their welfare systems and devote so much to improving their standard of living, because that freed them from spending on their own military budget. It liberated them to have this idea of progress that was about trade and cooperation and economic interdependence. Part of that dream has turned, as we've seen, into a nightmare where the Nord Stream pipeline that Germany marshaled as one of its signature policy innovations that tied it closer to Russia. Now we're seeing the destructive impacts of that choice. This belief that if you just trade with Putin's regime and tie yourself to him, that somehow this will lead to peace. Thankfully, Americans in their, somewhat exceptional and even isolationist way of looking at the world, we want to be apart. We want to be separate. So we're not going to ever have our energy needs completely dependent in such a way on a foreign power. And that's good. So I think there are major failures in the European approach that we're seeing, that without military power, without increasing your military budget and getting to 2%, which was the NATO target that Germany had been resisting for such a long time, without that, there is a risk that countries like Russia will come in and try to dominate you. And we've seen that that's not a hypothetical. That is happening as we speak. And Germany now in particular is in an extremely vulnerable position because of those choices.
Coming back to your mention, Sam, of America as also the standard bearer for capitalism, there's a question here from the audience: is the failure of America to be a flag bearer of democracy? Our audience member says a sign of the failure of capitalism as the monetary policies of America control its democracy.
I think that's a difficult question, but I do think it's very important to look beyond the hype and rhetoric with which these succeeding liberal great powers, your country before mine, have ruled the world, and look at what they're really doing, which has consistently been to prefer market freedom to political freedom. And I actually think that market freedom can make a big contribution to human welfare, although the growth it involves can devastate the planet, as we now know. But there are many different forms of spreading markets. We had welfare states. The United Kingdom built one. West Europeans built welfare states in the middle of the 20th century, which the United States never did, and certainly not to the same extent. And people around the world don't just want market freedom for the rich, but welfare for all. And that is what America so fervently has repudiated in the last 30 or 40 years. That's what I call neoliberalism. And so whoever is going to lead the world needs to find an economic model that exploits the potential of markets, but also understands the importance of their constraining them and redistributing their fruits and making them sustainable. America has not even begun to have that conversation, I think, in its externally facing foreign policy. There's no reason Europeans couldn't, and someone will, because that's what's appealing and that's what makes democracy work, is welfare.
Do either of you think, Melissa asks, that China and the US can live together, or will there be an inevitable confrontation? We had to come to this at some point in the hour, I think. Shadi, do you think confrontation is looking increasingly inevitable? How would you phrase it?
Well, look, we already have confrontation at some level. The question is, how bad does it get? Do we end up actually having a direct military or even an indirect military confrontation that raises the stakes? I certainly hope not. But I'm of the belief that when you try to appeal to the better angels of authoritarian regimes by reaching out to them, by trying to bring them into the WTO. Let's recall that part of American policy for decades was about integrating China into the global markets. And that is what helped China become an economic powerhouse, not in spite of the US, but at least in part because of the US being willing to bring it in. What we learn with these authoritarian regimes is that you give them something, you try to bring them in, and they take advantage of you. They see that as weakness, and then they press for their advantage. And that is what China has been doing. So I think that, look, we tried to integrate China, but there cannot be two. There shouldn't be, and there probably can't be two simultaneous superpowers. So at some level, there is going to be a zero sum competition. I hope we can find ways to avert confrontation, but it shouldn't be at the cost of American primacy. We shouldn't just keep on giving things to the Chinese regime in the hope that this will make them feel better, because it probably won't. And we're seeing how they become more and more aggressive, regardless of what the US does.
Well, you're talking about American primacy, Sam. You were talking about the necessity of a multipolar world. How do you respond?
So I think I disagree most with Shadi on this point. Uh, the fact is that most of recorded history is multipolarity, different power centers that coexist and sometimes get into conflict, but often kind of expand through the innate appeal of their ideas and practices. And a lot is going to turn on whether America once again chooses a confrontational, indeed military, stance towards this rival it has. And we're in the early days, but that's what's scariest about the future. And it's mostly in American hands. America is world spanning in its power. It has more than 500 military bases and many more drone bases. China has one overseas base in Djibouti, on the Horn of Africa. It's very hard to say ideologically that China is an expansionist power where predecessor empires have been. Uh, we can get into the South China Sea and Taiwan, over which there's been some saber rattling. But on the basis of very slender evidence to declare the necessity of confrontation, especially military confrontation, is to write the obituaries right now of millions of people who will die as a result. Why? On what basis?
So if I could jump in there. So I think, first of all, this is a good reason that the US needs to maintain its military edge. And luckily, up until now, the gap, if you look at military spending between China and the US, is tremendous. The latest defense spending bill for for the US is around 850 billion. For China, it's around 230 billion, give or take, depending on exchange rates. So there is still a massive gap, and that should be maintained. And that also shows that China, at least at this current moment, doesn't really have a way to effectively confront the US. The US is still in a stronger position. But I would also ask Sam, I think, how is the responsibility ours? How, especially when China has become more aggressive precisely as we were allowing them to enter the global marketplace. If anyone is wondering about this, it's worth going back to Bill Clinton's 2020 speech where he talks about the promise of bringing China in. That was a fig leaf towards the Chinese regime. How did they return the favor? How did Russia return the favor where Germany tried to bring them into an economically interdependent relationship? I think there is quite a bit of evidence that shows that China is not willing to be a good faith actor. And I should also say, I think the discourse around the rise of China is wildly overhyped. I mean, China is literally destroying its economy as we speak through its absurd zero COVID policy. Americans, especially unfortunately, my American liberal friends were like, "Oh, if only we could be more like China at the start of the pandemic and create these instant hospitals that the Chinese can build in 5 days." Now we're seeing the dark side of the Chinese model. They
And
can't
Shadi, can I
adapt.
ask you, from what you've just been saying, are you saying that America's military advantage and its strong man edge is a part of it being a force for good in the world?
Yes, that we need to maintain that edge, because if China ever comes into military parity, they're going to be more emboldened to challenge I mean, not just U.S. primacy in a broad sense, but God knows what they might try to do vis-a-vis Taiwan.
So, Shadi,
Yeah.
just having picked up that point, I want to bring in a question from Derek, which to you in particular, saying, Shadi, how do you account for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars? How can you just call them mistakes, but we're still better than China?
Well, so I don't just call them mistakes. I called them some of the greatest strategic blunders of the modern era. I consider that to be a moral stain on America. And not just that, the fact that we have a terrible Middle East policy. We can talk about our support, our unquestioning support for the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians. We can talk about how we prop up the Saudi regime, which is one of the most repressive in the world, with Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS. These are all moral stains. But my solution, or my what I'm proposing, is that instead of giving up hope on the US, each and every one of us, if we're American citizens, but also if we're watching from afar, that we try to do whatever we can to make America better. If America is capable of changing, then there is the possibility that we can learn from the sins of the past, including in Iraq and Afghanistan. But for me, there is no moral equivalency between, let's say, the Iraq War and what China is doing to the Uyghurs in its own territory, to its own ostensibly Chinese subjects or citizens. I don't believe that America is capable of committing genocide on its own American citizens. And maybe there are people who, think that that's possible, or they consider racism to be equivalent to genocide. But this is where I think a lot of the moral equivalency arguments don't stand up. We have to be clear about what evil is. America might be bad. We do bad things, but we do not rise to the level of the evil that we see when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, for example, in their genocide against their Muslim minority.
So that is a key point, Sam, isn't it? In Shadi's argument for the case that the US, on balance, is a force for good in the world. Do you take that on?
No, I guess I'm not sure the point being made that America is not stooping currently to the Chinese levels of iniquity. Well, it did in the past. There was genocide on the American continent, and not to mention slavery. And that doesn't mean that I'm making a claim about moral equivalence, and certainly not excusing Chinese practices. But the Iraq War led to millions of dead. That's just not the number that have died in Ukraine to date, or in Western China, in the internment, which is despicable, of so many. So we can't have a double standard where America can make troubling mistakes, but we then support unholy military spending so it can keep other powers at bay who show no evidence of military threat to others. With
Can
the
I at this
sole
point
counterexample of Taiwan, which of course China interprets as historically part of its country.
can I bring in another question from the audience, which is about the US and its choice of allies, saying, what about the US continuing alliance with Saudi Arabia despite the brutality of that regime?
Well, precisely as I mentioned, and for those who know my work and what I write about, I'm very outspoken in my criticisms of pro-American dictators in the Middle East. And that doesn't just apply to Trump's indulgence of MBS, but also Barack Obama in turning a blind eye towards to the return of dictatorship during the Arab Spring. What happened? Islamist parties started doing well and even winning in democratic elections. And then the Obama administration, after their initial enthusiasm at the start of the Arab Spring, really turned in a very different direction. And one thing that I lay out in my book is the lead up to the coup in Egypt as just one example of how the US turned its back on its own ideals. So I'm very comfortable calling the US out and calling out US officials on that score. But I also believe that down the road, if enough of us try to change the conversation, I think we are seeing some of this when it comes to Saudi Arabia. I think there's a growing sense among Americans that this relationship goes against not just our ideals, but our interests. But the great thing about America is I can make that case, and I can hope to see that change, God willing, in my lifetime in the next 10 to 15 years. I'll just say one thing about what Sam just mentioned. you know, it's maybe a quibble, but I think it's important because it gets at a fundamental difference. Millions of Iraqis died, but it is not the US that killed all of those millions. We have to be careful here about how we describe this. Yes,
No,
we
I
have a
mean
lot
more
of.
regionally. I take your point completely on
Yeah,
the
yeah. So I
numbers.
think intention is important here. I don't think, as bad as some American officials are, I don't think they wake up in the morning and think to themselves, how do we inflict more pain and suffering on the Iraqi people? I think there were some
We're
Bush
talking
administration,
about impact, aren't we? We're talking about whether America is a force for good in the
but
world,
I
not
I
whether
do
it wants to be.
But
I
there's
do
the
think.
break it, you bought it principle. When you topple a government, all the consequences are on you.
Yeah, so I think intention does matter. I don't deny that for the people who are on the receiving end, it doesn't matter what the intention is. But if we're being analytically fair, I think intention is relevant because it gets to the moral distinctions that we make between the US, or say Britain on one hand, and Russia and China. There are Chinese and Russian officials who wake up in the morning and they do think to themselves, how can we make the Ukrainian people suffer? How can we kill or re-educate, in scare quotes, more Muslims in our own territory? So I think that does actually tell us something important about the nature of this competition.
And I think this is a good point at which to pause, because I'm going to give each of you a minute or so to sum up your case. And I'm going to remind our audience, thank you for the questions that are coming in. There's another one I'd like to put at the end. But when you've heard first Sam and then Shadi summing up their case, I'm going to be asking you to vote again on what you think. The question we're looking at today on Intelligence Squared is, do you think, on balance, the US is a force for good in the world? Now, Samuel Moyn, I'm going to ask you first to give us a minute or so on where you stand.
I'll conclude by saying that the question of whether anything is good can't just be a comparative question. It leads you to some dark places where you say the United States may have made some mistakes, but at least it's not even worse. And that's, I think, a first step towards thinking about whether the United States is good. But our biggest obligation is asking, what's the relationship between the good it's providing and the better world we have to bring about, including through placing pressure on the United States? And for that reason, I think the answer ought to be that whatever good America is, it's not good enough, not by a long shot.
Thank you very much, Sam. Shadi, over to you for your final statement. Shadi, just checking whether we can hear you or not. I think we were talking about intention, and entirely accidentally we seem to have. There we
Sorry?
go. We've got you back. Shadi, we're going to give you a minute. We had lost you, and I think your video may have frozen. but I'm going to invite you to, on audio, sum up your case, please.
Okay, Philippa, can you hear me? I don't know what happened there.
We've got you. We've got you.
Okay, wow. Okay, that's a frightening moment to have a bad connection. I don't know why that happened. But yeah, so I'm an odd person to defend maybe this idea of America as a force for good, because I'm not someone who wants to whitewash the past. I do want to acknowledge and have a moral reckoning with where America has gone wrong, especially in the region that I focus the most on, the Middle East, but you could also extend that to Latin America. But I think there is a way to have a middle ground here, to engage in that moral reckoning, because part of the American idea is this idea of self-correction and self-criticism. So I would pose the question to the audience and ask them this: do you believe that America can be better? Do you want America to be better? And if you answer,
You have frozen for me, Shadi, and I'm going to ask you actually to switch your video off. And just to pick up on that question of, do you want America to be better? What is your question to the audience?
of course, good. The alternative is,
I think we're struggling with your connection, Shadi, and therefore, please don't take it amiss, but I am actually going to put the vote to the audience in the last couple of minutes of our broadcast.
are poor and struggling. We are seeing that it is happening right before our
Shadi,
eyes. Now, yes.
Shadi, I'm going
So
to actually ask if we can put the vote to the audience just because of the time.
yes,
And I hope you don't feel badly done to. Your case has come through pretty strongly. So can we put our poll up on the screen for the audience? The question is the United States a force for good in the world? You can vote yes, you can vote no. You may still be undecided as to what you think. And just as a reminder, at the beginning of the hour of our event, you voted agree 35%, disagree 38%, and undecided 27%. I am looking at all the devices spread in front of me and going to see the final result come up in the next few minutes. But I'm going to watch, and I may break in, but I want to give Shadi a moment now, just to say one question that came in, Shadi. If you were in power, what one thing would you do to make the US a more positive influence? Do you have a kind of 30-second thought on that? I'm obviously very off-putting, Sam. I'm going to come to Sam to answer that question about what could, or what one thing would you like to highlight that would make the
I
US more of a positive force in the world?
I think that the United States, contrary to Shadi, could afford to lower its military budget and use the funds for welfare to make America as a model more appealing, because really no force in history is more transformative than what millions of people across the world demand from their governments and want out of life. And America's first and foremost role is to model an appealing option in world affairs more than to confront evil regimes.
Thank you very much for that thought. And the results are coming in. I don't know whether Shadi can hear us or not. I think he can actually. But the final vote result. Thank you to the audience for being with us, for being engaged on the issue. Is the US a force for good in the world? On balance, agreeing 51%. Disagree 39%, and undecided still 10%, down from the original 27. So the ayes have it. By a very small margin, it has been decided in our debate that the US is, on balance, a force for good in the world. I'd like to thank you both for a great conversation. Encourage you in the audience to check out the latest books by our speakers, Shadi and Samuel. I'm Philippa Thomas. Do have a lovely evening. Goodbye.